It's Sounds of a City, the Human League, Travelogue.
I still don't think there's another album that's ever been made that sounds even remotely like it.
It kind of took a punk attitude into electronics.
There's a lovely kind of mixture going on, constant sort of blending of influences in Sheffield.
It's a very 80s sound that I think a lot of people copied.
I went out and bought the Travelogue album pretty much as soon as it came out.
It's just utterly terrifying.
You know, we had a manifesto, for God's sake, saying that, you know, everything had to be created electronically, no guitars.
Whether you were into your rock, you were into punk, or you were into electronic music, it just had something that you thought, I've got to have this record.
So you've kind of got, you know, like spacemen who have to put the rubbish out. And that's Sheffield.
Like old men's comments of, what are they? Is that a girl or a boy?
Any band that wore makeup, I was instantly drawn to.
Just admire the simplicity of it so much. I just love the kind of clash between this kind of super industrial music and then Phil Oakey just talking like dinner.
People like David Bowie were ringing up to say, you are the future of music.
Welcome to Sounds of a City, the Human League Travelogue. I'm Colleen Murphy, founder of Classic Album Sundays, and in this Sounds of a City series, we will choose an album that was a seminal slice of wax from our featured British city. In future shows, we will investigate the music of Liverpool, Manchester, and Edinburgh, but on this program, we will explore Sheffield, and I have chosen the Human League's Travelogue as Sheffield's pivotal album.
Been out all night, I needed a bite. I thought I'd put a record on. I reached for the one with the ultra-modern label and wondered where the light had gone. It had a futuristic cover lifted straight from Buck Rogers. The record was so black, it had to be a con. The auto changer switched as I filled my sandwich, and futuristic sounds wobbled off and on. It's the one without a face. It's the hit that doesn't fit. You can only see the flip. The black hit of space, sucking in the human race. How can it stay at the top when it's swallowed all the shops?
The Human League with Travelogue's opening track, The Black Hit of Space. And here's Martin Ware, formerly of the Human League and currently of Heaven 17, recounting how they wanted it to sound like nothing else.
We were obsessed with not making it smooth like the first reproduction album. So we thought, right, the first track we do on this album, we're going to overload every channel we can find on the desk and just make this racket. So they'll not make any, it doesn't matter what they do to it in the mastering, it's going to sound like synth punk. And I think we achieved that. But that all comes from a kind of bolshiness that, again, goes back to to the kind of people we were in Sheffield. The whole idea of popular culture mixed with the recent kind of popular science thing about black holes, and the idea of a hit that's so popular it goes beyond number one into minus figures, and as a kind of metaphor for the disappearing up its own backside of the music industry digitally, I think is quite an interesting one.
When one thinks of Sheffield, the Human League's sophomore effort may not spring to mind as an album that was a focal point within the city's musical landscape. And it was a difficult choice, as there are a host of fantastic records from which to choose, such as Pulp's Different Class, ABC's Lexicon of Love, Heaven 17's Penthouse and Pavement, Red Mecca by Cabaret Voltaire, and of course, the Human League's own triple platinum Dare. So why Travelogue? In my ears, this album is a springboard for many of the aforementioned records, as it has a rudimentary pop sensibility that was later polished and given a glossy sheen by Heaven 17, ABC, and the second incarnation of the Human League. The Human League's second studio album also features the avant-garde sonic experimentation. The band were explicit about the choice of synths over guitars on this LP, and this was emblematic of many of Sheffield's acts and their disdain of rock and roll cliches and the general fostering of synth pop in the wake of guitar-fueled punk. And the repercussions from the Sheffield electronic music scene were felt in other British cities, such as Manchester with New Order, Liverpool with orchestral maneuvers in the dark, London with the Art of Noise, and even across the pond where you can find its traces in Chicago house and Detroit techno. And my final reason for choosing Travelogue, it was recorded and produced in the Steel City, Sheffield. Human League co-founder Martin Ware.
If you accept the concept that you are what you eat in terms of sound, it's well documented that I honestly think that our love of kind of found sound and music concrete and all that stuff is largely subconsciously based around the sounds of industry that we heard around ourselves when we were growing up. Because in Sheffield, it wasn't just the big factories. I mean, everywhere you went in the city centre, there were small engineering shops with grinding sounds and, it was everywhere. You couldn't move for it. Of course, it all got destroyed in the 70s, but when you were young, it was there all the time. So I think our love of noise, in the broadest sense of the word, was all part of that. And I think, from that point of view, you couldn't really imagine this being made in Luton, could you? Or even in some kind of too cool for school kind of outpost in London. It's an industrial sounding album. I suppose growing up, our kind of formative memories are of the space race and, landing on the moon and all the Apollo missions and all the drama. I mean, can you imagine that when you're at that particular age? When you're in a dull and depressing and apparently not very futuristic environment, or where there's not much optimism around, you'd see this on TV and go, wow, in the year 2000, we'll all be flying around in cars and jetpacks and everything will be okay, there'll be no more disease and, and everybody will be happy and there'll be all this weird music. And so the year 2000 became this kind of metaphor for optimism about the future. And you could visualise 2000 sounding like such a magical time, magical destination. And so I just think everything for us, and I can only speak for myself and the people around me, seemed to be about anything that embodied the future and wasn't about the present or the past was something we wanted to be associated with.
And another Murphy lass, Roisin Murphy.
I lived in Sheffield for many years, and in fact Moloko was started in Sheffield. It's the Sheffield concoction. There's definitely an emphasis on the future. I think that stems out of the same thing we were saying. It comes out of, a sort of fetishizing of modernity and not wanting to be too romantic, too silly.
And Jarvis Cocker, Six music presenter and Pulp frontman.
I think there's always been a preoccupation with the future and, for whatever reasons, of the future and escapism and science fiction and stuff like that, coupled with a very down-to-earth kitchen sink mentality as well. So you kind of got, like spacemen who have to put the rubbish out. And that's Sheffield.
TV producer, filmmaker, and ridiculously knowledgeable Sheffield music fan Lee Ford.
The music that grew out of Sheffield grows out of Sheffield and still grows out of Sheffield very organically. It finds a sound within the city that it finds from its industry, or it finds from its environment, and it finds from the people there. With bands like the Human League, then you can't ignore the industrial side of where it came from. Same with Cabaret Voltaire. It had that sense of uniqueness about it, and I think bands like the Concert Angels picked up on that. I still think people like Richard Hawley are picking up that sense of a nostalgic Sheffield. Bands like Def Leppard were about wanting to break out of the city and go and find themselves in the rest of the world. But it was all down to it wouldn't have happened. These guys wouldn't have happened unless they came from this city. The city is as much of a backdrop as Liverpool is to the Beatles.
Someone stop the clock when we should have started early. If we miss the morning meeting, our lives will be in danger. Our lives are in his hands. We pay with Krugerrands, the currency of pain to help us leaving. Well, back in our homeland, the ones who make a stand are taken from their homes and no one hears of them again.
It may not be obvious, but the album's reverberations are still felt by contemporary Sheffield acts. Here's Charles Watson of Slow Club on his favorite tune from Travelogue.
My favourite song is Dreams of Leaving. There is a kind of Berlin thing going on around the same time as like Threads. It's a film by Barry Hines set in Sheffield after like a nuclear apocalypse. It was late 80s, early 90s. They used to play this film Threads, and it's basically like a public service film essentially about what to do in the event of a nuclear bomb going off. And the bomb actually goes off above Swindon, but the blast wipes Sheffield out, and it's so scary. I watched it on the Megabus once with a really terrible hangover on a laptop. I definitely think there's a feeling of that in the record. It feels like there's this kind of tension. They've gone to Berlin. I don't know if this is the case, or they've gone somewhere where there's still quite a lot of political kind of restrictions on where you can go, and I really love the fact that it kind of fades out and you think it's over, and then it just kind of comes back in this kind of second form with like these weird synths.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
Fahren auf der Autobahn. Wir fahren auf der Autobahn. Wir fahren Streifen grüner Rand.
Welcome back to Sounds of a City, the Human League Travelogue. Electronic pioneers Kraftwerk wanted to create a new post-war and specifically German musical language. In 1976, they played at Sheffield University, and much like the Sex Pistols' first appearance at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall in the same year, Kraftwerk's performance was a catalyst for Sheffield's young musicians to weave their own musical fabric. One of the attendees was Richard H. Kirk, frontman for undoubtedly one of the most significant and influential Sheffield bands, and one that helped me dream about what Sheffield may be like from a Boston bedroom far, far away, Cabaret Voltaire.
I think it was me who turned Martin Ware on to Kraftwerk. I was playing music at a party that Martin came along to, and I don't think he'd heard Kraftwerk before, and I know, that was quite an influence on them, but I would say there were a lot of bands that formed after us. I mean, I might add, Cabaret Voltaire were the first. We played first live show in 1975, which was a couple of years before the League, so we were kind of already established. But it became a bit of a standing joke in Sheffield, the drummerless trio, because it was quite a novelty in those days that you didn't have a drummer, because we both used like electronic rhythms and drum machines and stuff.
A large part of the zeitgeist for us were our friends Cabaret Voltaire, who were our mentors in a way. Had total admiration for them. We were really good mates. We used to go to parties together and hang out, and we thought they were the coolest. Just about admiring their methodology, and so they were a big influence on a lot of bands in Sheffield, Cabaret Voltaire, and I think they were the sun that we all orbited round.
Because there was always a bit of a rivalry, between Cabaret Voltaire and Human League. We were the kind of main bands out of Sheffield from that era.
Roisin Murphy. I've seen that time and time again throughout the history of Sheffield music, that there's this sort of like endless soap opera going on between the players, and that's because it is a small scene, and it is because we all mix with each other,
Jarvis Cocker.
For a long while, the Human League were going to be the next big thing, and I think that probably them and Cabaret Voltaire, they were the first. They started off this kind of template for Sheffield bands, which was known as the drummerless trio. So there'd be three of you. We all know that a trio is three people. The rhythm would be produced by either a drum machine or often a tape machine at the back, and there were loads of bands like They Must Be Russians. An early incarnation of ABC called Vice Versa. Loads of bands who had that lineup.
Martin Ware.
You got to understand the context that we grew up in. Our formative musical years were all based around going to see early Roxy music, Bowie, glam, just before that. We were obsessed with New York Dolls and Suicide and a lot of those kind of New York arty type things. Also obsessed with the general German scene, Cannes, Neu, Faust, Amondour, which is the more dark end of the hippie thing. Plus, we were all enormous. I know this isn't trendy, but both myself and Phil in particular were massive fans of prog rock, as we call it now, which I think is a bit of a derogatory term. We regarded it as it was a very important thing in our lives. Now, actually, I still listen to that stuff a lot. Van de Graaff Generator, King Crimson, Red. What an amazing album! Absolutely amazing.
Like the album cover for their reproduction debut, the cover for their second LP does not feature a picture of the band themselves, a remit by which many electronic musicians still abide. With its dark twilight hues and a blurry, out-of-focus image of a man being pulled over the snow by a pack of dogs, the Travelogue album cover and title are suggestive of a longing for flight, according to Human League co-founder Martin Ware.
It was actually the last thing that got written on the entire album. I mean, the last piece of creativity, including artwork and everything. They were literally screaming at us for a title and a cover. We didn't have a cover either. And I found this photograph in an old National Geographic, and I just thought, what is so evocative, that? I loved the fact that it was out of registration, so you got little green fringing and all that. Always been obsessed with graphic design, even though I never studied it. And when you blow it up, it looks even weirder. And to us, it was like I think Travelogue is indicative of wanting to get out of Sheffield. So it's like a kind of mind travel.
Lee Ford.
It feels like the album sleeve doesn't show from what I remember, the front out of the album sleeve and the CD sleeve is a photograph of I think it looks like a movie still, and it feels again like it doesn't say anything about the city, it doesn't say anything, very little about what the band looks like on the front sleeve. It felt like a soundtrack album. You felt like you were being drawn into something that was almost cinematic in a way. And the sleeve did that. And the very first Human League albums, really up until Dare, didn't really feature the band on the front.
It's always been about building soundtracks for imaginary films in my head. And so that really is, in a nutshell, what Travelogue is. It's a bunch of juicy little short films in people's heads.
I think that's absolutely spot on. Martin couldn't have said it any better. Absolutely. You close your eyes and you listen to that album and you're watching a very, very dark movie that has its own narrative. The track that opens on, going into Mick Ronson, going into Being Boiled, all those songs, they're about a youth quake that was happening in the late 70s, early 80s.
Of course, we were the first band that I know of that actually had a full-time member of the band who just dealt with visuals. It's a bit like a less interesting version of Hawkwind with a naked girl on stage. We had to have something that, because we were such dull performers, that we had to have like visual accompaniment, we felt. And actually it turned into an epic thing.
We all went out and bought Being Boiled. Whether that was you were into your rock, you were into punk, or you were into electronic music, it just had something that you thought, I've got to have this record. We all got together the day after and went, have you got this fantastic single? And what is going on? Is this the future of music? Any song that is about silkworms really does have to be held up in esteem for who could make songs out of that. Nobody else like the Human League. I think Being Boiled still works. It's got that John Carpenter, almost a Assault on Precinct 13 drony synth sound, and it's quite ominous, and it almost feels like a soundtrack. and I don't know who got there first. I don't know whether John Carpenter came up with that riff or the Human League did, but they're very, very close. He played the two of them back together, and there's that strange, ominous drone that runs through it, and that sense of there's quite a sense of threat to it, and very much they both are soundtracks. They are. One's a soundtrack to a movie, and one's literally a soundtrack to a generation. But I think Being Boiled is still that track that I can listen to now and go, that is essentially the Human League.
Listen to the voice of Buddha saying stop your sericulture. Little people like your offspring born alive for some guy studying Buddha's watching, Buddha's waiting. Just because the kid's an orphan, it's no excuse for thoughtless saying. People don't forget this torture. Just because you call her mother doesn't mean that she's your better. Once more with the voice of Buddha, he'll say carry on your slaughter. Who cares for the little children you may slice with no conviction, blind revenge on a blameless victim. Listen to the voice of Buddha saying stop your sericulture. Who cares for the little children you may slice with no conviction, blind revenge on a blameless victim.
Futuristic electronic pop at its best, with the second recorded version of Being Boiled, which first appeared on their Holiday 80 EP, and possibly so ahead of its time that it didn't become a hit until 2 years later when it entered the UK top 10.
Six Music.
This is BBC Radio 6 Music.
Six Music.
I'm Colleen Murphy, and welcome back to Sounds of a City, the Human League Travelogue, an influential Sheffield album that is considered a foundation for many subsequent bands, record labels, and albums from the city. Cabaret Voltaire's Richard H. Kirk gives us a snapshot of Sheffield's socio-cultural climate when young computer operators turned musicians like Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh were getting into electronics in the mid-70s.
There was a bit of a scene in Sheffield. There were a lot of people who were unemployed who were starting bands and doing weird stuff, and because you didn't have to go to work, you could stay up all night, you know, kind of just knocking around the city and getting up to mischief. I mean, there bugger all else to do, you know. It's you kind of, you know, a lot of the time you made your own, you know, we weren't we weren't well off. You know, you made your own kind of entertainment, and I think that's one of the reasons why Roxy Music was so massive in Sheffield. You know, because people, you know, it was like a great excuse to dress up in weird clothes and a bit of makeup.
Roisin Murphy.
Visual art and music, there's strong ties, you know. Roxy Music come from a art school. People loved Roxy Music in Sheffield anyway, that's for sure. I'll bet you that the Human League were obsessed with Roxy Music.
Along with being obsessed with Roxy Music, the Human League, along with most of Britain's young aspiring musicians, took a musical cue from David Bowie, hence a cover of former Spiders from Mars guitarist Mick Ronson's Only After Dark. This is an apt inclusion as the record has a nocturnal undercurrent, and Martin Ware, formerly of the Human League and currently of Heaven 17, reveals how their studio surroundings may have also contributed to the somewhat overcast mood.
So we were recording the album in our studio, Monumental Studios in Sheffield, which was actually a derelict building on its own, which used to be an old vet's with, like, used dog syringes lying around and 100 milk bottles in the kitchen, and literally there's only one room that we decorated, the rest of it was derelict. And we used to record until the night. Richard Mannering was up in Sheffield working with us, and there was only our floor that was lit, so at night it was the building was black, because we didn't want anybody hanging around, right? Would have been very easy to mug us. There were no emergency alarms or anything, and we had a lot of equipment in there, and the toilet was downstairs, so you had to take a torch to actually even go to the toilet. It was pretty grim. Our experience was like trying to be happy out of darkness. When you really are in a grim situation, you want to be optimistic, but you can't help sounding a bit dark.
Although they were fans of London's art rockers and Germany's electronic innovators, many of Sheffield's acts, including the Human League, often felt at odds with the other musical scenes taking root around the country.
Actually, we always felt like outsiders. Deliberately, though. You know, we had a manifesto, for God's sake, saying that, you know, everything had to be created electronically, no guitars. You know, it's the opposite of Queen with no synthesizers. So we were outsiders in Sheffield because there were a lot of resentful musicians who'd been working for years doing clubs and pubs and going, yeah, we're going to be the next big thing. It never happened for them because they weren't sufficiently different. We were struggling to find a core market because there wasn't one. We were literally number one in a field of one at that point. And then, of course, like Gary Newman came along. And OMD and blah, blah, blah. And it all, you know, then it became, you know, synth pop became a thing. And we were just a bit ahead of the curve, which is a good thing in one sense, but a bad thing in sales. I remember, and it's a cliche, but it's true, I used to be sent to bed early, as you are when you're like 7 or 8 years old. I used to have like my treasured possession was a transistor radio, which I used to listen to under the bed covers. So Mum and Dad couldn't hear it. Listening to Radio Luxembourg and listening to the sound of it drifting in and out was part of what really appealed to me about the kind of soundscapey, atmospheric thing. I often do things now where I go, if I can't think of anything to make it sound like it's coming through a shortwave radio or a longwave radio or drifting in and out, because it reminds me of that period. And I remember listening to things like Good Vibrations and the theremin stuff, and all that stuff sounds amazing on a transistor radio, and anything that, literally anything that had synthesizer in it, even like Sparky and his Magic Piano, you know, really going back. There was a program called Junior Choice on radio. What is now Radio 2?
My piano? But you're talking.
Yes, I can do
And they used to play all these weird tracks for kids, and that was one of them. And this idea, and I didn't know it was a vocoder at the time, but I thought, wow, this is really cool. So it's always appealed, really. And then, of course, when it started becoming a part of the armoury of rock bands, there was a new swathe of affordable synths.
The Human League's Philip Oakey.
By then we were just totally primed for synths, and actually because we'd come out of prog, disco was a real surprise to us, and it was really nice to see the stuff moving in that direction. I think we'd first heard synths from Walter Carlos on Clockwork Orange, where we came out of the cinema and just looked at each other and said, I've never heard anything like that in my life. So we were primed and we were trying to get stuff anywhere, but we were listening to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and stuff like that. It was a breakthrough that you could make things do what people had been trying to do ever since there was dance music. And I think pop music is so based on dance. Now, everyone forgets that each generation, but the Beatles were dance, you know. But they'd always been trying to make the beat very, very steady. And suddenly there were machines that would do it. And you could have that, what they called robotic, is what everyone had been fighting to try and get on their records already.
The sonic experimentation of the 70s Sheffield music scene heavily influenced late 80s, early 90s electronic musicians throughout the country, like Paul Hartnell, formerly of Orbital.
It was definitely the beginning of the kind of electronic instrument revolution, that kind of mid-80s. You know, you'd had all the pop music that was doing it, and then it was like, right, okay, now it's your turn. Totally for the younger generation, you know, here's all our old equipment that we're getting rid of because we're all successful in getting new stuff. And, you know, all of a sudden the second-hand shops are full of great old synthesizers that people buy and just start doing their own thing.
Sheffield native and DJ, producer, remixer Todd Latee also pays tribute to the sound of synths.
All the synths that I used to borrow off local producers were similar. Like if I'm sat in my studio now and there's some synths behind me, and there's one there called SH09, which to me just sounds like Sheffield the minute you put on. And yeah, like I use that every other record, you know, and that's just because I was in Sheff and someone had it, and it sounds to me like home. Similar synths, it was like stuff that was from an era that's kind of, it's almost like they've been just circulated around the scene. That used to be his, that's his, he had that one but it broke so Robert fixed it, now it's his. It's like, it's mad, like it's like a pool of, like a sound palette that everyone's just borrowing off each other.
Jarvis Cocker.
People have this theory that, you know, because Sheffield's full of industrial noises like that made people make music that way. I always used to think that was a load of rubbish, because I thought, well, you know, if you're hearing that day in, day out, then the music you're making, you would want to hear something different. But I'm sure, having thought about it, it probably did have some influence, because people got used to sounds that don't really occur in nature, like deep bassy sounds, like there was a drop hammer, which really made a kind of thing, sub bass, you know, made the whole ground shake and stuff. So I guess the only, you know, normal instruments, drums and bass and stuff like that, can only get certain frequencies. A synthesizer, you can really go very, very low sounds, very, very high sounds. So maybe the fact that a synthesizer could get to these kind of sonic realms where the industrial sounds came from, then maybe that made people in Sheffield want to go that way, but that is just a theory. I have no evidence to base it on.
Often it is circumstance that dictates the protocol of musical movements, and affordability was key for kids from working class backgrounds like Richard H. Kirk and Martin Ware. It was also the freedom that an unbreakable machine offered in comparison to the rules and regulations of the punch-in and punch-out daily existence witnessed by the steel industry offspring.
So if you actually look at the Roland System 100, which is what we created Being Boiled on, you had to literally patch everything together to make a sound. So the sounds that you create are very much aimed at, isn't this amazing? You can do things like, it's had a patch called Extreme Applause, which is just this thing that went and Funky Frog. which went wow, 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 wow. And then you had, and these are all like things you have to spend about half an hour patching up to get. And then things like, I don't know, thunderclap, which didn't sound anything like a thunderclap. It went. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that machine, the System 100, it fulfilled our hunger for being able to make original sounds. And one key thing about this particular synth was it said in big letters at the top of the patch sheets, it said, there are no illegal connections, which meant that you could not break it by plugging anything into anything, which is really cool if you think about it. It means it encourages you just to go, oh, what would happen if we did this into this? It's not all about that rational process. It's not thought out for you like presets. This is like, I don't know, let's have a mess around and see what happens. We can't blow it up. That, to me, is the essence of why I love electronic music.
No, and hell no, and I ain't gonna tell you no more. I just tell you, goddamn, I ain't gonna tell you no more.
Paul Hartnell.
Hearing kind of indie electronic music, this darker, kind of less commercial kind of thing, was such an eye-opener for me. You know, I'd heard things like, I'd bought The Sound of the Crowd by the Human League, and I'd loved things like, you know, Our Friends Electric by Gary Newman. And these were kind of darker sounds, but they were still kind of pop songs, whereas some Cabaret Voltaire songs, you know, you'd hear something like Cut the Damn Camera, and it would just be a vocal loop of someone saying cut the damn camera over and over a repetitive beat over this kind of motoric kind of thing. And it was like mind-blowing at the time. It kind of encouraged me to try and get hold of synthesizers and buy stuff, which was they were actually very cheap then, because everybody was getting rid of their analog synths to replace them with DX7. So, you know, you could buy synths now that cost thousands of pounds for like 40 quid and things like that. So, you know, I bought my first drum machine for £230 because it was, you know, going cheap because everybody wanted digital drum machines. It was a 909 drum machine. They're now worth thousands, you know, because it's an old analog drum machine, and I thought I was being hard done by at the time. It kind of took a darker, grittier, kind of more amateur turn, which, you know, and from amateurs comes, you know, great innovation quite often.
Roisin Murphy.
What I found was when I moved to Sheffield that I immediately met lots and lots of people who make music. I'd been really, really obsessed with music in Manchester, but I wasn't surrounded by people who made music. In Sheffield, you can't avoid people who make music. Every second person you meet is a producer, or a DJ, or in a band of some kind, you know. So it's very much a place that fosters musical talent, and it's a safe kind of it seemed certainly then to be quite a safe, cosseted environment for musicians and people to kind of grow their talent. I mean, the first people who took me under their wing were Rob, who ran Warp, and for some reason he saw something in me, and him and his wife used to cook me dinners and introduced me to people, and you know, this was before I even considered making music, but they seemed to see something in me. I don't know why. Through them I met Ian Anderson, who did the design for Warp as well, the graphic designer for Warp, Designers Republic, which also has a very sort of Sheffield aesthetic, but kind of via Japan and Moscow and the moon. And yeah, just really cool creative people with a real aesthetic, a real solid aesthetic.
Both the Motor City and the Steel City experienced an industrial decline in the 70s, and this made an indelible imprint upon young bedroom producers. It was the industrial funk of acts like Cabaret Voltaire and the early edition of the Human League that precipitated techno, represented in the UK by Sheffield's most widely recognized dance label.
When sort of Warp appeared on the scene, they set out a whole new standard of dance music, of sort of British dance music, and a whole style and a sound that was fantastic, that was so based on, for me, it sounded like it had come directly from, Cabaret Voltaire and people like that, but especially the Cabs, I think. But they had a really kind of round, stark, sort of warm and dry sound that was brilliant, I think, Warp Records. They had a real, it's not often you get labels with such a house sound, but they still managed to stay for years and years and stay interesting and develop over time until that now there's something completely different. So, I mean, I know Richard H. Kirk went on to work with Warp under, different guises and things like that, and they kind of embraced their heritage of this industrial funk and created a dance music sound that had, a lot of house music born into it, but was taking that kind of darker industrial edge that I guess in a similar parallel to what Detroit did. Kind of had a darker take on it and a more European kind of influence, taking stuff from, Kraftwerk, who were quite, were industrial in their time.
When I listen to the old Rob Gordon productions and mixes, who's like the original Warp guy, it's a similar type of ethos, really. There's a very big emphasis on the bass. It's electronic, sort of designed for a sound system, British style. It's quite rough, it's quite ragged. It's like, it's very similar. Before I even heard them records, I was kind of weirdly doing the similar type of sound anyway, like not by terms of like the programming, but the way that I'd use synths and stuff. It's weird. I don't know if it was a subconscious decision or if I just isn't Warp or what. But when I revisit those old Warp records, this doesn't actually sound too dissimilar to what I'm into and what I'm doing. It's crazy. The Warp sound was based on Robert Gordon, so that is the start of what you see now with Warp Records, like the big bands and the Hoodmos and the whoever's. It all comes from Robert, and Robert lives at the bottom of my mum's road. And Robert used to walk past my house all the time. He's a dread, he's quite distinctive looking. And then when I met other people into music when I was older, I always kept hearing about Robert Gordon, because he's the guy in Chef that'll fix your synth, or he'll fix your speakers, or he'll mix your tune. So everyone going on about him, but everyone always talked about him in a very high regard because of what he'd done for the city musically. And then one time one of my synths broke and I got his number and I called him and he went, "Oh, come to this address." And I was like, "That's at the bottom of my mum's house." And I went down the bottom of the road, took a left and knocked on the door and opened the door, and it was like, "Oh, that's that guy I've seen since I was about 4 years old." And so there's that. For me, it's quite that early Warp sound that kind of Robert and Parrott and Winston and them did. It's not only do I find it artistically very interesting and I'm proud that it came out of our city, but it's quite personal in a way because I've grown up seeing it before I even knew what it was.
Sheffield was and is a small city with a surprisingly large number of creative people who have built their own cultural climate that has not only affected those within the city limits, but also those outside. From the 70s through to today, there has been a wide array of musical acts and flavors. But is the Human League's Travelogue in particular one of the most seminal Sheffield albums in terms of its influence and reach? Martin Ware.
In terms of influence, for the people who know, I mean, it's like a lot of people still haven't really discovered these albums. I think this stands up to the test of time. I don't think it sounds like a period piece. I think it's still an influence for electronic musicians today.
Jarvis Cocker.
I think it's the most Sheffield of the Human League's records. Dare, obviously, is much more widely known. The first album probably is the purists' favourite or whatever, but Travelogue it's kind of like they found the feet, and in another universe that would have been a massive album. Like it starts off with the Black Hit of Space, which is about a hit single that becomes so popular that it gets to number one, and then it goes into minus figures, and we go into an alternative universe, and that's really what should have happened. And in my imagination, that's what it did.
Lee Ford.
I think it put the city on the map for a long time. You had A&R guys coming to find the next Human League, or A&R guys coming to find, the next rock band. It really gave the city confidence that, if those guys can do it, then we can do it. Because it wasn't about the musicianship, it was about the look, it was about the style, it was about finding yourself and finding a voice. We can do anything in this city. We can create music, and we can create music for a world stage. And I think that went away for a little while, but again, I think slowly with the Arctic Monkeys and Richard Hawley and people like that, it started to come back. There's a real confidence that we're a musical city, and I think there's not many other cities that you apart from maybe Liverpool, and I think we even beat Manchester, that have had the caliber of musicians and bands that have come out of one city.
I still don't think there's another album that's ever been made that sounds even remotely like it. This is our attempt to be, more like a proper band. Another key point to make is that we thought of ourselves as artists, not as pop musicians. We were artists that loved pop music and were working in that vernacular, because we were never that bothered about money. I think that's what the soul of an artist is.
The Human League Travelogue is a reflection of the avant-garde persuasion of acts like Cabaret Voltaire and Clock TVA, a stepping-off point for behemoth pop albums such as Dare, Lexicon of Love, and The Luxury Gap, a precursor to warp techno and name-checked by contemporary Steel City acts. It is a record that has both generated and underpinned Sheffield music in its many guises, from industrial to funk to techno to pop. Head to the website for a full track listing of all the songs played in the show. Coming up next month, I will choose an album that was both a musical instigator and an expression of another great northern city, Liverpool. For now, we will leave you with the album's closing track, WXJL Tonight. Thanks for listening.
The way it was in the past, a long, long time ago, before staff levels dropped, they used to listen to the radio and listen to the DJs talk about the songs they didn't know, as if it really mattered. It big or bonnet show, I don't want you to go tonight. 10,000 watts of power, headlines on the hour tonight. Our music beats the best, you just don't need the rest tonight. Once I couldn't care at all, but I can feel the ratings fall tonight. Years ago, no one seemed to care. The people must have known the DJ's role was only there to fill in space between the songs, to talk of love and other things, as if they didn't matter. Automatic stations came and sent them all away, and now I'm left alone. I haven't got a word to say, and you're the one who makes the choice to turn me on or turn me off. But now it really matters. Hit, pick or pony show, I don't want you to go tonight. 10,000 watts music beats the best. You just don't need the rest.